The Embattled Farmers. By 1732, the King of England had 13 colonies on the Atlantic seaboard of North America. Then, 50 years later, the colonists won their independence after a grueling David and Goliath struggle. They had overcome everything the most powerful empire in the world could throw at them. The heroism continues to inspire the embattled farmers standing up to the monarchy's proud soldiers in their dark red jackets. That's Concord Bridge, 1775. But this audacious and superhuman story is only partly true. What are the facts? By the 1770s, many colonists were fed up with British taxes, that's for sure. These were levied by the Parliament in London, where no representatives from America were seated. The patriots rose up to cast off the yoke. But not every colonist was a patriot. Only about 40%, or 800,000 of the white population of 3 million, were committed to the cause of liberty. Another 40% were moderates who just wanted to be left alone in peace. And 20% were Tories loyal to the King of England. The percentages changed somewhat depending on how the war was going, human nature being fickle. In the popular telling, the uprising started when the Patriots pulled a plucky stunt in Boston Harbor in December 1773, the Boston Tea Party. Dressed as Indians, as if going to a costume party, the fearless rebels jubilantly tossed heavily taxed tea off ships at the wharf into the water. But the jolly Boston Tea Party was not so glorious and did not win unanimous acclaim. It was not even called the Boston Tea Party at the time. The protesters were dressed as Mohawks to avoid identification and arrest. Many citizens saw it as a crime. The British governor of Massachusetts, Amherst, had been out of the country at the time. A new governor, Major General Thomas Gage, was installed to tamp down the uprising. The British authorities called those who boarded the ships a criminal mob. Some colonists, such as Ben Franklin and George Washington, thought destroying the tea was a mistake because the strike against private property could damage the cause. King George punished the city by closing the port and banning political meetings. The idea that the Boston Tea Party started the American Revolution is widespread, but there had been years of violence involving British troops in Boston. At the Boston Massacre almost 4 years earlier, 7 British soldiers fired into a crowd of volatile but unarmed citizens in the street. 5 were killed and 6 wounded. The Patriots called themselves the Sons of Liberty and used mob tactics, force, and intimidation, including tar and feathering to undermine the British rule. This crude and rude form of vigilante justice began in medieval Europe. Pine tar was used for waterproofing ships. It was not as hot as modern petroleum tar when heated to a liquid, but often blistered or burned the skin. While pouring or painting on the tar was extremely painful, no one was known to have died as a result. When the tar was covered with feathers, the humiliating appearance of a large chicken was achieved. From 1766 to 1776, there are more than 70 recorded incidents of this public humiliation across the American colonies. Only 50 years after it happened, in the mid-1820s, was the Boston Tea Party given its jaunty name. By then, many of the participants were dying off and the nation was looking back nostalgically. The act now seemed the foundational moment in the revolution itself. Much of the violence in Boston and elsewhere was forgotten. Although the Tea Party did not start the revolution, the situation did deteriorate afterwards. In 1775, 2 years later, the rebels were preparing for war by stockpiling weapons and ammunition. That April, the Patriots learned that a British force was marching from Boston to seize arms stored at Lexington and Concord. As the story goes, Paul Revere rode through the night to alert the militiamen or Minutemen. Paul Revere's midnight ride, calling out "The British are coming," was immortalized in a stirring poem by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow in 1860. This was 85 years after the fact. In the poem, the fate of history is in one man's hands. In reality, 2 writers set out. William Dawes rode a parallel route south of Revere's to be sure the message got through. They both made it to Lexington, but Revere was captured by the British before he reached Concord. He was held a few hours before being released without his horse. It was, in fact, a third man, Dr. Samuel Prescott of Lexington, who arrived in Concord that night to alert the town. But poetic telling requires a single hero taking on the powerful foe alone, so Paul Revere rides on in the popular imagination. About 4,000 militia quickly turned out when warned of the British regulars marching out of Boston, 1,700 strong. The Redcoats overwhelmed the Patriots at Lexington Green, then moved on the neighboring town of Concord. When they arrived in the cold morning hours of that early spring day, they built bonfires for warmth. A force of militiamen, some 500 strong, were on a hill outside town guarding an arms cache in a barn. They saw the smoke above the trees and went on the offensive, thinking the British were burning their homes and massacring their families. The Minutemen met a company of British soldiers at Concord Bridge and gunfire erupted. The 100 British at the bridge were badly beaten. The King's men returned to Boston and the rebels kept their arms. 73 British soldiers were killed and 49 Americans lost their lives. None of the colonials had been professional soldiers. As usually conceived, this was the first shot fired in the Revolutionary War, but farmers had taken aim at the Redcoats in violent uprisings since 1774. It was Ralph Waldo Emerson in his 1837 poem, The Concord Hymn, that has owned the narrative. Quote, "Here once the embattled farmers stood and fired the shot heard round the world," end quote. This was not hyperbole. The American Revolution was truly an epical event of worldwide importance. It proved that both monarchies and colonial governments could be overthrown. The British claimed that they were fired on first, and the Americans defiled the bodies of their dead. The Americans said the English started it and killed unarmed people in their homes, besides dragging pregnant women out of bed. At the time, though, colonists were still mostly angry with Parliament, not the king. But the radicals, inspired by Enlightenment thinking, wanted a revolution. And in the months following, further bloodshed in Boston convinced King George III of the American treachery. In August 1775, the king proclaimed that his American subjects were definitely now in a state of open rebellion. His troops must do their utmost to put it down. To those Americans who still saw themselves as loyal, this was a terrible blow. The king had just turned them into traitors like the rest. In January of 1776, the king's popularity took another hit when the pamphlet Common Sense was published and advertised in the newspapers. The author, Thomas Paine, argued that independence was the answer to America's problems. Paine was masterful in his use of simple language that persuasively appealed to a wide audience. Common Sense, really a piece of radical propaganda, became extremely popular and had its effect on public opinion. The widespread conception is that the Declaration of Independence was signed in Philadelphia on July 4, 1776. In fact, the Declaration was signed on July 2nd, only its ratification was completed on July 4th. It's said that a little blond boy relayed the news to the old man in the Independence Hall bell tower, who rang the Liberty Bell so loud that it cracked. The story of the Liberty Bell's starring role is not true at all. George Lippard, who usually wrote bloody Gothic tales, tried his hand at historical fiction in 1847. He gives us a blue-eyed boy shouting "ring" to the old bell ringer on July 4th, temporarily restoring the vigor of his youth. On July 8th, when the Declaration was actually publicly read, some of the bells in Philadelphia were rung to announce that the citizens should gather. But the Tower of Independence Hall, the old State House, was being repaired at the time, and the bell was out of commission that week. Nonetheless, fiction became accepted as fact, and in 1865, Abraham Lincoln's body was set next to the Liberty Bell after his assassination. And in 1917, the image of the bell helped raise $21 billion during the First World War. The bell actually cracked soon after it was delivered, cast in London in 1752. General George Washington's decision to cross the Delaware River with 2,400 Continental soldiers in the early morning hours of Christmas Day, 1776, was a true American triumph. It sounded foolhardy, but Washington understood that his Continental Army desperately needed a morale boost after months of intense fighting with several significant defeats. His surprise attack allowed the Americans to vanquish the highly trained Hessian German mercenaries at Trenton. That was the first major American victory in the war. There were 5 more years of war after 1776, with some low points bravely weathered, such as the winter of 1777-78 at Valley Forge outside Philadelphia. The American capital, Philadelphia, had recently been occupied by British troops. This winter is vividly imagined, with the army in tatters and thousands without shoes, George Washington praying to God in the snow. With divine help, his intrepid army in blue held on. The truth is, Washington didn't just watch his army starve and freeze to death that winter. Valley Forge was a defensible position, a day's march from Philadelphia. In fact, at Valley Forge, log cabins were built, and the men without proper shoes and clothing, counted at most at 2,898 in March, were protected from the elements. This out of an army of 12,000, up to 20,000 by late spring. It has been said that the American Army was actually born there that winter at Valley Forge, with professional training and an officer corps. In June, the British abandoned Philadelphia and Washington engaged them at Monmouth, New Jersey, driving the redcoats from the field. Even the women of the colonies had been brave and stalwart. Molly Pitcher, it is said, wandered the field at the Battle of Monmouth, bringing water to her husband and his fellow soldiers. Suddenly, Molly's husband is shot and dies or is only wounded, depending on the version. She bravely avenges him by taking his place at the cannon and pounding the enemy, helping assure victory. The next morning, General Washington gives her a gold coin and promises that her services will never be forgotten. In other versions, he makes her a sergeant. Molly Pitcher has appeared in school books, but this heroine is probably made up, or perhaps embellished from soldiers crying out for water as she walked along the lines with a pitcher, calling, "Molly, bring the pitcher, Molly, pitcher." There are no first-hand accounts of her being at the Battle of Monmouth. Molly's legend arose in the 1830s and 40s when people who had actually served in the war were passing away. Historians started collecting anecdotes secondhand, and accuracy was often sacrificed in favor of a good tale. The nation's patriotism was growing ever stronger, and stories of America's revolutionary heroes were popular. Molly Pitcher was one of the favorites. She's probably fashioned out of several patriotic women. One of them might have been Margaret Corbin, who was wounded at the Battle of Fort Washington, New York in 1776. Margaret Corbin received a war pension. Now for the biggest myth of all about the American Revolution. Against all odds, in 1781, the Americans were victorious and the British Army surrendered. This narrative is essential to our national identity. It pictures us people having a special destiny, that their country was ordained to lead the rest of the world to freedom. It's a picturesque story, but there are major omissions. While Washington was at Valley Forge, the French signed an official alliance with the Americans. France was England's main enemy and wanted revenge after losing Canada and the lands east of the Mississippi to the English in 1763 at the end of the French and Indian War. The French had been smuggling guns to the Patriots since 1776. Now the French Navy on America's shores completely changed the course of the war. British supply lines from England and the ability to move troops by ship were threatened and sometimes cut off. There is no way the upstart American farmers and shopkeepers with their own muskets could have defeated the mighty British Army by themselves. They would have utterly failed. The fact is, the United States became central to an international alliance against the English. After France in 1778, Spain in 1779, and the Netherlands in 1780 went to war against Great Britain. The last major land battle of the Revolutionary War was in 1781 at Yorktown, Virginia. The British surrendered to Washington's army of American and French troops. Besides the French nobleman and military officer Marquis de Lafayette, individuals from other nations volunteered to help in America. Baron von Steuben, a Prussian military officer, offered his services. He reported to Washington at Valley Forge and continued to serve until the end of the war. Von Steuben played a leading role in reforming the Continental Army into a disciplined and professional fighting force. Among the Polish contributors who came to America were Thaddeus Kosciuszko, a brilliant engineer and military strategist, and Casimir Pulaski, the father of the American cavalry. Chaim Solomon, a Polish-born Jewish immigrant, raised over $650,000 for the Continental Army through fundraising and his own personal contributions. That's $9.4 billion today, which funded the empty American war chest during the final Yorktown campaign. Poland itself had been erased from the map in 1776, partitioned between Russia, Austria, and Prussia. Battlefield deaths in the war had been 8,600 American, 2,100 French, 400 Spanish, and some hundreds of Indian allies, the Oneida, Mohican, and Tuscarora. On the Imperial side, 8,500 British, 1,800 Germans, 1,700 Loyalists, and 500 Native Americans were killed in battle. The Native Americans being Mohawk, Seneca, and Cayuga. Tens of thousands more combatants on both sides were wounded, and more tens of thousands lost to disease. A smallpox epidemic, lasting intermittently for 7 years, broke out in 1775. Altogether, 130,000 Americans died. The public was wary of inoculation, learned in 1721 by Puritans in Boston from an African slave. American troops, concentrated and physically stressed, were very susceptible to the disease. But George Washington in 1777 mandated inoculation for all Continental soldiers. Many historians credit this precaution with the colonists' victory in the Revolutionary War. As it was, 17,000 smallpox deaths were among the American soldiers, including perhaps 10,000 who died while prisoners of war, mostly confined to ships in New York Harbor. The American war effort was occasionally feeble. The militias were usually unreliable, but could perform admirably with leaders who understood them. The Continental Army, however, was quite adept, and the Americans were generally able to take advantage of the enemy's mistakes. British leaders made some serious blunders. They never orchestrated an overall general plan for winning the war. Even if the uprising could have been terminated by British might in the early stages, generals during that period, especially Howe, did not promptly, vigorously, or intelligently apply that power. So mortal blows were not dealt. There's also a grave lack of understanding and cooperation between British commanders at crucial moments, as with Howe and Burgoyne in 1777. Finally, the English counted on Loyalist support that did not materialize for the most part. So the outcome of the war resulted from a combination of British ineptitude, American efforts, and French assistance. But the decisive role of the French was quickly played down in the United States. Early history told the story of the Revolution as a morality tale with good victorious. By the time Emerson wrote his Concord hymn in 1837, Americans thought they had won independence as triumphant underdogs. It was a sacred story. We were raised up to proclaim liberty to all people everywhere. The thought that others were crucial to our victory or even helpful impugned that we had not controlled our own destiny. So that part of the story became omitted over time. George Washington, hero of the Revolution, became the first president of the land of the free. This was indeed a crucial turning point in world history. It established the United States with its representative democracy and numerous great civil liberties. But although the Revolution eliminated many forms of inequality, it did little to change the status of women, despite the role they played in winning independence. Most significantly, it failed to end slavery. In the first U.S. Census in 1790, there were 698,000 black slaves and 60,000 free blacks. In modern times, the story of the founding of our country is sometimes used to unite us, sometimes to divide, saying only certain people are true Americans. But there is much to admire and be proud of without partisan manipulation. Within a couple decades of the American Revolution, France, Haiti, and Latin America had revolutions of their own. Ours is the world's oldest written constitution and a pattern for free peoples everywhere. The colonial days were the childhood of the country. We went out on our own. But the myth that America is self-sufficient lives on. As during the crucible of the Revolution, America needs other countries. And the world needs America at its best.